Okay, so we're recording, and Tara's here to help me monitor the chat. So as we go through, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and she usually is able to get to them before the end, but I think we should have a few minutes at the end for questions as well. So post-flood responsibilities. So the important thing about preparation, and this is part of your preparation training, is to have a plan. And so you want to prepare on the blue sky days before something happens. So having printouts of permits or some of these FEMA publications, if you want physical hard copies for people that may not be as computer savvy or just prefer hard copies, you can order them for free through the FEMA distribution warehouse. So if you just type that in, there's a publication order form and you can order them for free. So having that as part of door hangers, that might help. So door hangers are a collection of documents like permits and notification to property owners, and you can go through like door to door and just put them out there so that they're aware they're in the floodplain, that they have been damaged, and that you're going to have to come and do the full substantial damage assessment. So that might be the best way to reach people that have been damaged by flooding or other disasters. They may have evacuated, and so as soon as it's safe, if you're able to get out there and just whatever you can do to get the word out there and let them know that, again, you need to do the assessment. They are going to have to get a floodplain development permit to do any repairs, and if they are substantially damaged, that we would have to verify that they're in compliance with the current regulations and the current maps, or that they would have to be brought into compliance. So you can have those materials put together now, and then that way, if something happens, you're ready to go. Because your office or your own home might be damaged in a disaster, and so you'd have to deal with that and then just have some kind of way to have continuity of operation. So having this for residents ready to go, as well as having some kind of disaster supply kit. So you'd want to have one for your own home and your family and that kind of planning, and then also one for your office so that you do have that continuity of operations and you have what you need to be able to go out and start the assessments as soon as you're able and it's safe. And so if the office has been damaged in some way, you would want, printouts of materials. So like your checklists that you would have for your assessments, any relevant maps, a contact list for your team, those printed form letters, just the types of things that you would need to be able to go out and do those assessments as soon as you can. So like a clipboard, a power inverter, flashlights, tape measures, gloves, ID badges, again, those door hangers that you've put together, signs, bacterial wipes, bottled water, and just that kind of thing so that you're able to organize, hopefully work with your team or us, depending on the situation, depending on how your community is set up in the way that you would do assessments and start on the recovery process. So having that planned out ahead of time is the best idea. So we'll go through some of that, and it would just depend on how much floodplain you have, how many structures are in your floodplain, and what kind of staff you have to assist you with that. And so part of that, again, preparation, training, and getting these things together beforehand, before something happens. Another component of that is outreach. So this was a poster contest that we did at a school on flood safety and stuff like that. So even these events with school kids can help get the community involved, and then other outreach events or community events that you can talk about floodplains and flood safety and permitting and stuff like that, social media, whatever avenues you have to let people know about flooding and flood safety, but also permitting and doing assessments. So we sometimes ourselves will attend these events, or we'll loan out our flood table, which is like a flood simulation table. It really gets kids' attention and gets them involved with stuff like that. So we are available for stuff like that. But whatever you can do to involve a wider audience, involve families, just doing that community outreach is another component of making sure that people know about these things. And then, of course, you want to start your work as soon as it's safe. So probably when the floodwaters have receded, if you're dealing with a flood, of course, don't drive into floodwater. That's very dangerous and the #1 cause of death after a flood. But there's also all kinds of stuff in the water. It could have chemicals that have leached into it, electrical wires. There could be breaks in gas lines. It's just kind of a dangerous environment after either a flood or other disasters. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you do need to be careful as you venture into the community before recovery is really started. So again, don't start estimates until it's safe to do so. Just be aware that you do have to assess structures externally and internally. So you need to go into those homes or businesses, and it could be also dangerous inside the structure. So many times the emergency management will go through and tag structures that are too dangerous to enter, but we'll talk a little bit more about substantial damage, and there's a lot of overlap on this recovery process with this and the substantial damage assessments and things. And so Tara next month will be doing our substantial damage overview, and that kind of really partners well with this class. So I definitely recommend attending that or watching that recording after this. Because that's a big component of what the floodplain administrator does after a disaster. So again, electricities, broken gas. We have seen mice and snakes get into houses after their burrows were flooded. So there's just all these different safety concerns to be aware of and be vigilant of. Okay. So we do have this Kansas Observed Flood Reporting tool. It's not very widely used, but it is out there. It's available, where you can attach photos to the map and help us document flooding and things. But at the very least, definitely contact us if there's flooding or any disasters that would impact the floodplain. And then sending pictures of high water lines or just flooding in general helps us document that, and it helps us with future mapping. And then, of course, we'd like to extend our assistance however we can. So this is a map that was produced by Manhattan in 2011. So they were comparing their floodplain with the flooded areas, because of course, where those two things overlap is where we do the assessments. We don't need to do substantial damage assessments outside of the floodplain unless, of course, there are certain areas that you regulate. So producing a map like this after a disaster and just knowing or having a list or a database of your floodplain properties will help you in the aftermath. And that way you know what properties you need to look at. Again, having all of this prepared beforehand is really the best practice. And that way you're not scrambling around because you're probably going to be stressed out. Again, you might be suffering personal losses during a disaster. And then the residents are also going to be stressed, and they're having their daily routines messed up, and they're suffering losses. So it's a very highly stressful and emotional time for everyone. So having all of this stuff ready to go as much as you can is really the best way to go about it. And so You might have to drive around to these properties to see which ones were impacted. Some cities like this that have their own GIS department will create these maps, generate them to be able to look at that. So here's another example. This is Eureka in 2016. They put this map together. So this is a tornado. Again, it's not just flooding. Tornadoes can clearly cause damage in the floodplain. So in this map, each of the green dots is a structure that's in the floodplain, and then you have the tornado path going through there. And so again, where that overlap is where we need to do the inspections. And of course, that kind of damage may be obvious in person as well, but knowing where your floodplain properties are located in your community is a big part of that. So having that database, and again, the SDE training, if you want to use that software, it's free software from FEMA to help you do those. You can build your property database ahead of time and just have that ready. So here's what we do as KDA DWR when we realize there has been a disaster here in the state. So we're notified somehow. KDEM may let us know if something happened. We're always keeping an eye on media posts about storms or other events. Or sometimes the floodplain administrator will just reach out to us and let us know that there was flooding or other damage in the floodplain. So we try to establish a scope. We have this initial contact with you, okay, about how many structures have been damaged, what do we need to do? If it's widespread flooding or widespread disaster, we may be spread a little bit thin if it's spanning multiple communities. And depending on what your needs are as a community, how many team members you have on your staff to help you, just depending on what you need from us. And we'll coordinate with KDEM and FEMA and let them know what has happened, what the scope is, so that they're in the loop and they're aware of what's going on. We can do open records requests for permits or something, but mostly we're working with you. We're happy to provide assistance in permitting. We can attend in-person meetings. We've done that before, depending again on the scope of the disaster, on what we can do and what the needs are. We have some of the FEMA publications that we can bring if you didn't order them ahead of time and you need them, or other technical assistance. We can help you with the gathering of data, again, if possible, and if it's needed, we can help with doing the damage assessments and helping you get organized and finding where those structures are that need to be assessed, and then going through the software and all of that. So those prioritization areas that could be coming from FEMA, it's hard to get insurance claim data with all the Privacy Act concerns right now, but finding where those areas are. Of course, we provide training like we are now. Again, the SDE course is coming up, or the SDE overview. And then we encourage you to have written administrative procedures for disasters and really just in general for floodplain stuff. And it helps give you a procedure for what you're going to do after a disaster that you can follow. I will probably send after this our DWR post-disaster manual, and that just has some tips in it. It explains the substantial damage and improvement rules. It has template letters for notification. It has the checklists in it for doing assessment. So it's a helpful resource, and I'll just send that out in my follow-up. Again, we can attend community meetings. Often communities will have public meetings after a disaster to discuss that. And again, visit those disaster areas for support or answer questions from citizens and staff about requirements and stuff like that. And then we're likely to do like a 1 year after the event audit of the floodplain program, and that's just to assist in any deficiencies where the recovery was supposed to happen. So we'll want to look through that documentation and make sure that all of the rules were followed in the recovery process. Because getting substantially damaged structures into compliance is probably the hardest part. Um, and then disaster recovery in general is probably the hardest duty of a floodplain administrator that you would have to deal with, probably aside from going to court. So you'll want to announce that you'll be doing substantial damage inspections. So you'd want to let people know what the rules are, why you're doing it, what's going to happen, that you do a thorough inspection of the exterior and the interior of the structure to determine that level of damage. And people may be confused that there are multiple entities coming to their house, like emergency management will come and look for other things like habitability and stuff. So there might be multiple state and federal agencies that are doing different types of assessments. And so they may think they've already been covered, but you are there to assess specifically the level of damage because they're in the special flood hazard area. So whatever you can do to get that word out, press releases, working with the public information officer, again, social media posts, media statements, again, town hall meetings, and just let people know that you're going to be doing that and that you do have to enter their homes or businesses. Yeah, so I was going to say something else. I lost it. Okay. So how do we prioritize structures and doing assessments? So again, as soon as it's safe, you want to do a windshield survey. So you're going to drive through the areas of floodplain, look at those structures and try to determine which ones are high, medium, and low levels of damage. And that way we can start to prioritize where we start because people are going to want to start to rebuild and recover and get back to normal as soon as possible. So sometimes even just the day after there's been damage, they are trying to rebuild, and any types of repairs of that nature in the floodplain need to have a floodplain development permit. And so that's why these need to be done in such a timely manner, that we have to get ahead of rebuilding because some of the structures may not be in compliance. If they're substantially damaged, they have to be brought into compliance. So once we have that priority list, we're going to do the medium damaged buildings first. And that's because these are the ones that are either at or below or about, they're very close to that 50% threshold that determines whether or not someone is substantially damaged. And so that's where we want to start and get those inspected and determined first. High damaged buildings are second. It's clear that they've had a lot of damage. They're substantially damaged. So it's going to take them more time to rebuild than the medium damage. So we have a little bit more time on that. And then the low damage buildings are last. They just need a straightforward permit to be able to do the repairs and the recoveries. So all damaged buildings have to be inspected. It doesn't matter what level of damage it is. We need to do the assessment and then determine what that level is. And there's a lot of guidance and training outside of this, again, like with our class, and there's a few other classes that I'll mention that go over how to do that. And they give you examples because you're going to want to train your team and make sure that everyone's on the same page as to how you're documenting it and counting that. So again, 50% is that magic number. We want to make sure that those are done first. And then, yeah, make sure everyone is getting a permit. So for the larger disasters, I know there's communities that don't have a whole lot of staff to be able to do all the inspections they need. Again, it's going to depend on the expanse of your floodplain and how many structures you have, how many of them were damaged in the event, and then making a plan from there. So hopefully you have that base plan. We recommend doing assessments in two-person teams for safety reasons and to make sure that you have kind of the consensus on what the level of damage is. So you'd want to train with everyone who's doing assessments beforehand to make sure that you're all in agreement, or maybe do the first assessment all together first. So you'd want to organize that team, have meetings to make sure that all of the addresses are covered. So you don't want any gaps or any overlap, and duplicate efforts that way. So you'd want to break up that property database into sections, which structures need to be assessed, and then make sure that each team knows what area they're responsible for and are then deployed to that area. Everyone has each other's contact information. Some areas or buildings you might need to get permission for entry. So that's something to be aware of. Wear identification, whatever you can, to symbolize your position as a community official. If you have an ID badge, or at least like a community like shirt or something like that, to be able to identify yourself to citizens. And then you, of course, plan those routes for each team. And of course, ask us for help. If we're able to, we will assist you however we can. Again, we might be stretched thin. FEMA does not always come to help in recovery. I think we've only seen it once. So yeah, but at least we're here. We'll coordinate and see what we can do to get additional help if we need it. So just looking at some high water lines, again, that's an important piece of documentation. So if you do see those, definitely send pictures of them for us. And in this case, it's a manufactured home, and usually if they're inundated to any degree, it's a complete loss. They don't stand up as well as traditional stick-built housing. And so you're looking at probably a higher level of damage than you might think for a regular house. They are often constructed with materials like particle board that kind of dissolves in water. So it's maybe a little bit easier to do manufactured homes. They can often be a complete loss because of that. Here's another example. So that's where the high water line is on this fence. It's pretty high, and you can see it on there. You can see it on the building as well. So that's useful in the field. Here's another example of the debris line on like a garage door, I think. So that tells you if something has been inundated, most likely, and a sign like this, where you see a bunch of possessions out in the driveway, often an indication that that structure has been inundated. So looking through newspaper and media pictures can be a good source. Piles of debris, carpet, insulation, sheetrock. The presence of construction dumpsters, that's pretty common as well, as indicators for areas that have suffered damage that need to be assessed. Again, yep, debris piles in this case, and then they're waiting for the adjuster. A lot of people are doing virtual adjustments nowadays, but yeah. And it is important that we get these done in a timely manner. We have seen cases where it wasn't, and then people will rush to sell their houses and not go through the entire process, so that, and we don't have disclosure laws in Kansas, so they don't have to tell new buyers about any flood history or insurance claims or anything like that. And we have seen this happen, like a for sale sign in the yard, and then they're trying to paint over mold and stuff like that. So it can happen. And of course, people are building back out of compliance, potentially. So that's why we need to get them done as soon as possible. And getting the assessments and those determinations out is really the first priority. We have seen a case where they weren't enforcing the substantial damage rules, where structures were supposed to be elevated, and then the city ended up having to pay to have all of those structures elevated. So it can lead to some pretty bad things if you don't get this done. And of course, doing the enforcement is also difficult when people want to recover. they're already suffering a flood loss, and then you tell them that they have to elevate their existing structure, but that's part of the rules, so that they are, responsibly redeveloping the floodplain. And we wouldn't want to punish a new homeowner for something that the previous owner had done, so just something to think about. Again, permits are required for repair or reconstruction of structures. So that's a permit for all the damage and repairs to any portion of the structure if it's in the special flood hazard area. And there is a difference between repairs and cleanup. If it's like an unfinished basement that can be mopped out and cleaned up, that's fine. If you have like a finished basement that ends up being flooded and then they have to take out all the sheetrock and the carpet and things like that, that would be repair, and then that's going to contribute to that percentage of damage. Okay. So again, making sure people know about permits, whatever you can, and making sure people are getting permits when they do small developments. If they're doing like a patio slab, fences, stuff like that. If you do the smaller permits, it's easier to ensure that people have to apply for the larger permits, like the substantial damage stuff. If you're not doing that, or enforcing the ordinance, people may just like try to get away with it. And then this is what a tag on a property can look like. So the building official in this case says no entry. So it's likely substantially damaged. So in this case, the piers were washed out during flooding, so the floor is now unstable. So again, having those printed materials to hand out in the field is good to have. So here's another example. Pawnee Rock, that city was damaged by a tornado in 2017. So this house is clearly substantially damaged. Most of the roof is gone, and it's just clearly more than 50% damage. So if it is, you don't have to go through the entire checklist process to look at everything. If it's clearly substantially damaged, then you would want to document that. Make sure that you're taking photos. And again, there's a lot of great training on how to do assessment specifically. We're talking more about the recovery process in this class, but there is a bit of overlap. So yeah, again, they're not likely to rebuild too quickly if the damage is this extensive. So that's why we're looking at the more medium ranked damaged structures first. And sometimes you can't really tell the damage just from the exterior. If you walked behind this house, you would see that it had a full basement where the foundation walls collapsed. So the entire back half of this house, the foundation is just kind of over the air. So there's nothing supporting that, but you wouldn't see that from the front. It looks fine from the front. So you, again, thorough external assessment, and then the internal, again, you wouldn't want to enter a structure if it's not safe to enter it, but whatever you can to get that assessment. We always want to be safe, but I think if it's at that level, it's probably substantially damaged. You might just have to do some more investigating, but be careful about it. Again, if the damage is clearly substantial, then you can just take photographs of that, document it, why it's substantially damaged, and then move on. So this is a manufactured house that was not properly anchored. I think it was in the floodway, and it wasn't anchored, so it just floated away up against this tree line, and then it just broke in half. And obviously that's a complete loss. So we can just document that. And then we do, of course, send them the determination letter that your structure was substantially damaged, and it's basically treated like new construction at that point. So right, so we determine the floodplain status. It's either in the floodway or the fringe or any other areas that you um, formally regulate, like future conditions if you have that adopted. Some communities adopt the 500-year floodplain, and then the extent of damage. So this is how we determine that percentage. You're looking at the structure's pre-damaged fair market value. So that's the fair market value for just the structure minus the land, because that would skew the numbers quite a bit. Just the structure, and then what the cost is to repair to its pre-damaged condition. So pre-damaged, not a pristine condition. So we are taking into account depreciation, and all of that is built into the software and that training and everything. But just so you know the basics, this is what we're looking at, and those two numbers compared gives us that percentage. So, okay. Mold is another concern that we have. It can start growing 48 to 72 hours after a surface has been exposed to water. And so again, that's why you would want to bring a mask and possibly gloves, long sleeves, pants, stuff like that to protect yourself from inhaling it. But you'd want to clean this up, so people would be ripping off the sheetrock. You have to let the interior of the wall dry very thoroughly before it gets rebuilt. Otherwise, you will have mold concerns, and mold can also lead to structural damage. So, and then after you've done inspections or assessments, you have likely been exposed to mold at some point in that process. So you want to make sure that that's documented, but also to clean your clothing off thoroughly so that you don't actually track it back to your own house or your office stuff. Again, the permit's required no matter what level of damage they have, and they have to comply with flood regulations. Some communities have adopted cumulative improvement requirements, so they are tracking improvements and damage over typically a 5-year period. So if you do have that standard, you would need to go and look in your permit files and see what improvements or damages have occurred in that adopted time period, and then total all of that together between the costs to repair damages and the costs of improvement. So permitting fees can be waived to help people during what is a difficult time, but not the permitting requirement. So, if they're going to elevate on fill, they may need a state permit from the Division of Water Resources. So, again, if it's been substantially damaged, it may have to be elevated. It has to be at least where the lowest floor is 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And again, telling people that they have to elevate their damaged structures often causes a lot of issues. We have run into this before, but that is part of the requirements, is that the structure is brought into compliance with the current regulations. So it could mean having to elevate an existing structure, which is expensive, but that is part of it. And one of the harder parts of doing the recovery is bringing people into compliance and doing that enforcement. So again, if they're going to do it on fill, they might need a state permit. Those building protection requirements apply. They would need the as-built elevation certificate so that we can prove the lowest floor is elevated to your level of freeboard, and freeboard in relationship to your current map that you have adopted. So if it's an older pre-firm structure that's substantially damaged, it likely needs to be elevated. They were built before the mapping, so they're not usually flood protected or elevated high enough. People are more concerned with tornadoes and stuff, so there's a lot of basements out there, especially for pre-firm structures. So that could mean having to fill in the basement and elevate that structure. So that is one of the harder parts, and making sure that people actually comply with that. Otherwise, they're in violation. So something to be aware of. There is this building inspectors group called the Heart of America that sometimes will coordinate with CADEM and help with doing assessments. And this is their rainbow sheet. So sometimes they're not doing the same level of assessment that we need to be doing to determine that level of damage, but this can be a good guide for you to kind of estimate that range and see what you might be looking for in terms of level of damage. You know, finding around where the 50% is and what you're looking for. So if the foundation is damaged, if that's the house is ajar on top of the foundation, you can see equipment is damaged. If it was inundated in 12 or more inches of water, stuff like that will indicate to you that it's close to that range. And again, we need to establish that and be consistent as we do that. And then it's a little bit easier to determine the really high damaged levels and then the really low levels. But again, damage can be deceptive to where you can't see it. So doing that thorough inspection is really key to making sure that we're making accurate determinations. And then, of course, if people don't agree with you, they can dispute that and provide better information to you so that you can reevaluate, reassess whether or not it's substantially damaged. So just something else to be aware of. They also have these tags sometimes that let people know that they're in a flood zone and that they're going to need to contact you to get a permit to do any repairs. So that might also be an idea for you if you're doing door hangers, having something in there that says you're in the special flood hazard area. These are the rules that apply. Here's where you can see the ordinance. And basically, I'm going to need to do an assessment to determine your level of damage, and we'll, determine what needs to happen at that point. So it kind of ties back to actually physically going there before you do an assessment to have that notification that you'll be entering the structure and stuff, because I feel like probably some people would be like hostile against having someone in there, but it's part of our responsibilities as a floodplain administrator. This is one of the best resources for questions on substantial improvement and damage and doing assessments as well. The substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference, it's very detailed on where to find market value, the costs that you have to include, what you can exclude, getting the itemized cost lists from a contractor, and different ways that you can do it and being consistent, stuff like that. It's very detailed. It's a very valuable resource. You can just find it easily online, or again, you can download it, or sorry, order it hard copies if you want. But this is very helpful. Same thing with the damage estimation software. Again, that software is free. And it's very helpful for doing both residential and non-residential assessments, because how you do those two things is different. Your community may already have a system in place where you don't use that, and that's fine. You don't have to use this software, but it's a helpful tool. There's a user guide to help you work the software, and then there's also best practices that you can find online. Both of those, all of those publications are very helpful and easily available online. You have that fully in-depth information that you might have questions about. Of course, we're here as a resource as well, but yeah, that's available. And then if you do want to learn more about the tool, FEMA also has a training course where you download data and kind of work through how the assessments work. And that tool also has the different ways that you can come up with the numbers for different things. If you are requiring everyone to have an appraisal or get an itemized cost list, that's fine. Or you can calculate it manually, what the market value is based on like square footage and stuff like that. So very useful software, and there's this training available on it. So again, the formula, the cost to repair versus the market value for the structure. So in this case, we're looking at a fire. And that's another thing, is that a disaster or damage can be limited to one structure, like a fire. We've had trees come down and crash into houses and cause substantial damage that way. So sometimes you're only doing it for one structure. So if it's $95,000 at the fair market value, the cost to bring it to its pre-damage condition is 63,000. Sorry, that's 66% damage. So that's definitely over the 50% threshold. So pretty simple and straightforward. Again, however you determine these numbers, you just want to be consistent about it. Here's some ways of finding it. Tax assessment records are one way. The bill of sale, if it's a recent sale. Sometimes insurance settlements or an appraisal is a really thorough way of getting it. Just make sure you're consistent with it for everyone and doing it the same way to be fair. So appraiser websites have this information. And then all of this again is in that desk reference. Maybe I'll send that out as well after this. But then it goes over what the cost of repairs, what you have to count and what you can exclude. So even if material or labors are donated, we do have to count them as if they were paid for. You can exclude stuff like debris removal, cleanup, plans, and permitting fees, but we do have to count materials and labor at the fair market value. And then we notify the property owners of that percentage of damage. So you send that letter that gives that percentage, how you determined it, the code citations, the permitting requirements and all of that, how to submit an appeal. And I will again send out our disaster manual that has template letters for substantial damage and non-substantial damage notification. And then again, they can dispute your resolution, that's fine, or dispute your determination, as long as they provide better information from an objective source like a general contractor or a professional estimator or something like that. And that's fine, and you can put this in your written administrative procedures so that it's out there for everyone to see. And again, there's a lot of things that you don't want to overlook. Ductwork, anchoring, flood vents. Flood vents would be part of compliance and stuff like that. Making sure that enclosure has enough flood openings. And any additional improvements that they put on top of the repairs would also count towards that. So even if they opt to not do all of the repairs, we're still looking at the cost of all the repairs. So even if they're not doing them, we are counting them towards that threshold. Right. If they're substantially damaged, they might have to be brought into compliance. Some of them may already be elevated high enough, which is great. So that's elevating residential buildings or getting a floodproofing certificate if they dry floodproof a non-residential structure. There's technical bulletins on doing wet floodproofing and dry floodproofing as well. So like a detached garage or an accessory structure, an agricultural structure, or a compliant enclosure. And then keep documentation of everything, copies of all flood-related documentation, so all the permits, your assessments, all the photos that you take, maps, all the appeal documents and decisions, those elevation certificates, all of it should be kept on file permanently. And again, we're likely to ask for it when we do the post-disaster audit. Here's just an example of something that happened in 2007. Coffeyville's levee was overtopped and it trapped a bunch of water. And then this refinery had a spill into that flood water, and so it caused a lot of substantial damage. Those structures could not be repaired, and so they were bought out mostly. So post-flood situation is the same as other events. So tornadoes are a common one that we deal with that cause damage to structures in the floodplain. And it's the same procedures, so the same recovery procedures no matter what type of disaster you're dealing with. And again, it could just be fire and limited to a single structure. And then this was a tornado that happened in Chapman, Kansas in 2008, just another perspective of what that might look like. So increased cost of compliance is part of the standard flood insurance policy. It's an extra $30,000 that can be claimed if you're substantially damaged to try and help bring you into compliance. It's not very much money when you have to elevate a existing structure, but it is there to help. Yeah, your citizens will come to ask you about advice on substantial damage. So we want to make sure that we give them the right money, or sorry, the right information, because it could cost them money if they don't like file on time and make sure that they get that ICC. But it is their part of the policy to help them come into compliance if they're in that situation. So there is talk of raising that amount, but that has not happened yet. And the quality of a good letter gives them all of this information about doing permits and how you made your determination, deadlines to appeal, stuff like that. And again, all of that's in our manual that I'll send out. So here's an example of an ICC project. This house needed to be elevated after it was flooded. So here you can see they've built a compliant enclosure, all the flood openings are there. And then this is the completed project. So we've set aside a couple of minutes for Amy Miller with FEMA to give some information about the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, or DRRA 1206. Is Amy on?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You did an outstanding job, Cheyenne.
Oh, thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Miller. I work for FEMA Region 7 and the Floodplain and Mitigation and Insurance Branch. So I'm going to be talking about the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was initiated in 2018. And two sections were amended, sections 402 and 406 of the Stafford Act. So we're going to talk about some of the policy goals, implementation, timeline. We'll also talk about how state, local, tribal, and territorial governments can utilize this resource after a presidentially declared disaster. We'll also talk about eligibility and community requirements, and also the grants portal website. Next slide. Thank you. So the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act of 2018 is the most comprehensive emergency management reform since 2006. And the great thing about it is it increases mitigation funding, it incentivizes disaster reduction investments, and it expands assistance for individuals and communities. And it also advances FEMA strategic goals. Next slide. And then one of the great things is Section 402 provides assistance to state and local governments for building code and floodplain administration, enforcement, including inspections for substantial damage compliance. I'm sure there's a lot of you on the call today on the training that would say, I'm doing 10 jobs rolled into one. Right? You may not have a staff to help you, but if there's a presidentially declared disaster in your community, as Cheyenne was talking about earlier, the local community is responsible for doing substantial damage determinations. This Disaster Recovery Reform Act 1206 provides communities incentive to apply for additional funding to help with building code administration and floodplain administration by having a contract to be able to hire additional staff and have reimbursement as far as doing enforcement activities, if you have building codes adopted, and kind of doing that in unison with floodplain administration. Now, this extra assistance that communities can apply for is for 180 days after a major disaster is declared. Next slide. And then the policy goals is really to increase overall speed of recovery. Just like Cheyenne was talking about a few moments ago, that when there is a disaster event, one of the first things that happens is everyone wants to come. If you're the floodplain administrator, they want to come in and have a permit and really get back to normal, right? They just want to get back to life. They want to get back into their structure. They want to have their business reopen. And so this really helps provide assistance and funding to complete post-disaster activities as far as doing building inspections, substantial damage determinations, permit application reviews. And it really kind of helps assist local communities that may have limited staff and resources. If there's a large disaster event, being able to kind of enhance compliance with state and local building codes as well as floodplain management ordinances by having additional resources to carry out required post-disaster activities. So for those of you that are attending this training today, this is great because you have the ability to have this training guide as part of your arsenal, and then also gives you the opportunity to sit down and think about if there is a flood event, do we have the administrative procedures in place? Do we know what we're going to do for substantial damage determinations? What administrative procedures would we do after an event? And so this policy became effective November 1st, 2020. And again, the funding is limited for 180 days after the disaster declaration. So I would encourage each of you that are on the call today to talk to your local fiscal representative for your community to see if contracts are allowed. If you're a small municipality and maybe the county does building code enforcement, that you talk to them and see if there's a partnership that can be done or an agreement that if there was a disaster in your community, could the county help you out if you're the county? Are there smaller municipalities that can help you out? Are there other building code officials that are familiar with floodplain management that could help you after a disaster is really crucial. Next slide. And then again, DRRA 1206 does authorizes FEMA to provide resources to effectively administer and enforce building codes and floodplain ordinances. And so you should, as a local community, if you have building code administration and enforcement, this can help you hire additional staff to review and process building applications, collect fees, train and supervise staff. And then again, the big one is code enforcement to inspect structures. And as we talked about before, having as-built elevation certificates that after a structure has been damaged, and let's say the community requires an as-built elevation certificate, having staff to be able to review that, conduct and process condemnation determinations. And then again, too, also looking to make sure that your floodplain management regulations are up to date, that you understand as a local floodplain administrator, or if you have contractual staff, how are you going to administer the regulations? How are you going to make sure that structures are brought up into compliance? And then having a mechanism for enforcement as far as processing permits, documenting, and then just having a substantial damage operations. Exactly who in your community is trained to conduct field surveys, prepare cost information, and perform inspections is really important because you've got to be kind of a well-oiled machine, because after an event, you have 180 days to utilize this funding. So you want to start thinking about now when it's blue skies, what other local officials can help you with this, what other building code officials can help with this, and start thinking about if something happened in your community, what are you going to do? Next slide. And then eligibility. So within the guidance document, it does provide a descriptive list of eligible activities. And again, that work is eligible if it's consistent with work that's normally done by the community to administer and enforce adopted building codes. And again, eligible work must relate to the repair, replacement, or retrofit of disaster damaged structures. It can include public, private, and residential structures. So things that are ineligible are activities associated with non-disaster damage development and activities to update community laws, rules, procedures. So for instance, if a community does not already have adopted building codes, you can't use DRRA 1206 funding to update your building codes, adopt new zoning requirements, or land use plans or floodplain management regulations. Those should already be in place. Next slide. So eligible costs, the biggest one is reimbursement. at the cost share for permanent work, overtime for budgeted employees, and straight and overtime for extra hires. So again, if you're a floodplain administrator, what does your local community allow? If contractual employees are allowed, great. If it isn't, you may want to talk to them about an opportunity to utilize this funding and maybe change that so that if there was ever a flood event or a major disaster, that you could use this funding and use this program to help with floodplain management, and also purchase of supplies and equipment necessary to complete the work. And then the policy includes discussion on direct assistance through flood insurance mitigation assistance risk management division, but this does not apply to public assistance. Next slide. So the community requirements, you want to make sure that you submit applications for reimbursement, and all supporting documentation is through the Public Assistance Grants portal. That's really important whenever there is a disaster event, that if you do have new hires and you have folks that are helping you with code enforcement or floodplain management activities, that you have supporting documentation, you know how many hours they worked, what's the rate, you know, kind of having all your I's dotted, T's crossed. And then supporting documentation to demonstrate completed work, demonstrate costs incurred, location of the work, and then you validate the EMAC resources of interstate and interlocal mutual aid agreements. Next slide. So I was formerly the state NFIP coordinator in Tennessee. And Tennessee was actually the first state in FEMA Region 4 that utilized this funding. So on August 21st, 2021, there were 17 inches of rain that occurred within a 24-hour period, and there were 20 people that were killed in Waverly. So if you think about it this way, for some of you that are floodplain administrators, what would you do if you had 1 in 15 structures damaged by flooding? So there was a total of 523 homes that were damaged, and 272 were substantially damaged. So Larry Lescure, very dear friend of mine, floodplain administrator, he was an army of one. So after this flood event happened, myself and FEMA Region 4 representatives went up and talked to the mayor, and they decided to utilize this program to be able to have additional assistance. So they're able to hire additional staff to help with substantial damage determinations, permitting, and then writing letters whether or not a home was substantially damaged or not. So what they did was that they tried to mail letters to homeowners. And then what they also did is, if a structure was substantially damaged, they made sure that they had a copy of that letter and they taped it on the front door. Because after a flood event, you have prospectors that come that are looking for cheap homes to buy, but they don't necessarily know that it's in a floodplain and that there's additional requirements. So again, doing outreach and education to your local elected officials, your realtors, your developers, your citizens, so that they understand what's going on is really important. Next slide. And then again, making sure that you review and process applications for building permits, hiring and training staff to conduct eligible activities. And really what this program is valid 180 days after a presidentially declared disaster. So you want to start thinking about now, who are some of the folks that are around your community that you could hire or have an local government agreement to have them come and help your community, have a contract for services, and provide training and information to your staff. And then just making sure that you coordinate for building code administration, floodplain management, enforcement, and then investigating structures under construction for compliance with applicable codes, laws, and ordinances. So some of you that may be on the training today, you may want to think about, with your building codes administration, do you have Appendix G adopted, which highlights floodplain management requirements? They kind of go hand in hand, they complement one another. And then, you know, as a public servant, we all have to investigate complaints. So that's some of the benefits of having additional staff to be able to kind of help you address community concerns. Next slide. So additional resources, if you guys are interested to know more, FEMA has DRRA 1206 policy, and then they have frequently asked questions, 2 volumes, and then there's also a public assistance companion guide. Next slide. So if you guys have any questions, FEMA Region 7 has staff that helps with this. And, if you have any questions, just reach out to Tara, reach out to Cheyenne and Terry and the staff. They'd be more than happy to assist you. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Amy. So just a couple of wrap-up slides here. Again, we want to stop rumors from spreading. That's another big concern that we have is, people giving out misinformation. So again, having that outreach after the disaster happens through these different avenues. And then I put an asterisk on door hangers because I just think that's a really direct way of getting the correct information to the people that need it in the special flood hazard area. And again, people are in a real hurry to rebuild and get back to their normal lives, and they're not going to wait for lengthy estimations to come through and getting those permits. So having that streamlined process ready to go is really important. Just last slide here. We do have resources on our site. We did just put up some NFIP resources like on its own page that has templates and information handouts. So if you look at our website, we have that page. All of our newsletters are there. This recorded training and other recorded training will be there as well. Again, Tara's doing the substantial damage class next month. And then that's basically it. So we're right at time here. So I guess we have probably a few minutes if anyone has questions. I did see a few in the chat. It looked like Tara got to most of them. Stop share. I did see one that was a direct message to me, whether there was a link between the National Weather Service and local emergency management offices for unified reporting platforms. That I'm not sure about. I think I would have to look into that, but I do have this chat, so I can look into that and get back to you. But other than that, does anyone want to come off mute right now or anything? Okay, so I will send that follow-up out. If you think of any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to help however I can. And I think,
I have one question. Did we want to see who wanted the CEC credit?
right, yes, sorry.
Yes,
Go ahead.
okay. Let me, now I gotta find it. Just give me 1 minute here. Oh, so ignore the 2 CECs. I apologize. This is just 1 CEC, but please fill this out and then Cheyenne will work to get you that certificate. Apologies, I didn't update that. That was for a previous training, but this will still work so that we can get you recorded down for getting one.
And yes, when I send the follow-up out, I'll send a post-training survey. If you could, fill that out to help us improve these trainings, the post disaster manual, the SISD desk reference, and yes, I will include my slides as well.
All right, it looks like most people have answered. So thanks everybody. We really appreciate you being on the training today. And please reach out if you have any questions.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.
Hey Cheyenne,
Yes.
what the poll didn't post on my end, or maybe that was Tara that was posting it. Should that have come up for the CEC? It didn't initiate like the other DWR presentations I've attended.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it, but did you want the certificate?
I do, yeah. All I
Okay.
saw was a black screen during that time, so I don't
Okay.
know if I missed it or
No, that's okay.
it just